So I thought Longlegs was mid. I was disappointed to find out that I thought Longlegs was mid. I wanted it to be good. And I just feel like I have a lot of complicated feelings about this movie that don't slot nicely into this movie was bad or this movie was good. I think it did some things extremely well. I think it did some things extremely poorly. And it's further complicated by the fact I had a conversation with my friend Addison who was like, well, it's kind of one of those movies that if it works for you, then it works for you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So I feel further eluded by understanding what people got from this movie.
Is it scary being an FBI agent?
Overall, I felt like it took something that had so much premise and kind of squandered it. Few things frustrate me more than a squandered premise. Here's why I thought Longlegs was mid. The reason I feel so strongly about Longlegs is the first 3 minutes of that movie are incredible. That is one of the best openings to a horror movie I've seen in a long fucking time. The way this movie uses red ass screens. I truly don't know if I've ever seen a graphic on screen in a movie that feels more spiritually pervasively red than in this film. I felt like the beginning of this movie was playing with the rods and cones in my eyes and how I perceive color because of how overpowering this deep, grainy red was. I thought it was so pretty. It just like spoke to my soul in a deeply unnerving way. It goes from this completely red screen fading into the first shot, and this long fade from red was so affecting to me, just kind of feeling like I don't know where I am in relationship to reality versus this redness. When will this redness stop? And as it keeps going, as it keeps getting cooler and cooler, we end up on a shot with a color temperature that feels colder than anything that has ever been. The beginning of this movie fucking rules. It works so well because it's this little vignette. It's shot in 4:3 in a more narrow aspect ratio, and it uses its frame to feel a little claustrophobic, to feel antiquated. I think that's another reason that the rest of the movie disappointed me so much, is that I loved what it was doing so much with the aspect ratio of the beginning of the movie that I wanted to see the whole movie like that. And then after the title sequence, it's like, we're going to scope, we're going wide, and it's worse for it. Like, I think it was trying to be like, that was then and this is now, and using the aspect ratios to do that. But it just felt like a really uninspired way of doing it. It felt like it grounded us in this reality that I didn't want to be grounded in. I would have rather have stayed in this hyper stylistic world. Yeah, the beginning of this movie is just bathed in these crisp, clean, perfectly recently fallen snow whites. We've got this white house with this angularity to it. And the entire beginning of this movie is so dreadful. There's this kid and you're like, oh God, this kid is fucked. I hope this kid is okay. And then we get our first encounter with Longlegs, who we only see the bottom half of at the beginning of the movie. And then the last shot before the title comes up is Longlegs bending down. We see like a frame or two of his face, and then boom, we're out. I think that's so effective because this movie shows us but also withholds understanding. It creates more terror by giving us a little but not a lot. So it wasn't just that I went in with the high expectations of the culture around this movie, but the first 5 minutes of this movie made me feel like this movie was going to be truly something special. Then, after the title sequence, I realize this is a police procedural?
Door to door, on foot, knock knock, have you seen this man? Just like in the movies.
Like, one, a cab. So, like, you really got to sell me on why we are spending this much time with the fucking police in a movie. So we had this beginning that was so good. And then it's like, hey, do you want to do a slow investigation for an hour and a half? And I'm like, no, that's actually not what I want. Thank you, though. And maybe that's part of the reason it didn't work for me, is that tension didn't exist for me. It was continually staying on things longer than they retained interest. It felt like at every turn, this movie was letting the tension seep out of its corners.
You wouldn't want to hear about it anyways.
Not nice things.
I don't think the Bureau has a division for nice things.
It felt like it kept making choices that were like the fifth most interesting choice it could have made, which just kept frustrating me. This movie wasn't making me feel depraved or empty or depressed or soulless. It was just feeling like it was choosing boringness and, yeah, the mundanity of evil, the ordinariness of evil, etc., etc. Sure, there was parts of that kind of worked for me, especially in like the extremely suburban energy of it, and the fact that we're going into all of these very normal suburban locales and seeing these grisly murders. I think thematically some of that is interesting and works, but the effect that it tries to go for is by boring you to tears, I think. I was just bored for so much of this fucking movie. A lot of my favorite horror movies have a strong protagonist at the core, like someone you can really empathize with and get under their skin and understand how and why they are acting the way that they are. The protagonist in this movie, it felt like the choices being made were constantly keeping us on the outside of her psyche. The main character didn't really have much personality or much to hook into. She just kind of looks shell-shocked and distant for the entire movie, which, knowing what we know about the end of the movie, is narratively justified, but it's not interesting. I wasn't particularly interested in her inner world because it didn't seem like the movie was particularly interested in her inner world. Maybe it was interested in having us speculate about it from afar, but it kept us at a pretty severe distance. Okay, so our two main characters in this movie are a girl who doesn't say much or have much personality, and a cop who speaks like he's talking in like a daytime TV procedural.
You identified a suspect's house. No prior knowledge, no real indication that it was any way different than all the cookie cutters all around it.
I did not vibe with his performance. I know it was going for a specific aesthetic thing, but it kind of felt like not great acting to me. It didn't feel like it was iterating on anything. It just felt like a guy. I couldn't stop thinking about that this is an actor playing a cop. This didn't feel like a cop. This felt like an actor playing a cop in a movie. I don't know. This performance was just really kind of lackluster to me. The mom performance was interesting to me, but like, I don't know. I just felt like this movie was constantly like, here's a creepy thing. Isn't that creepy? And like, there's this shot where the mom is just like, you haven't been doing your prayers, have you?
Do you still say your prayers?
And then she's like, I know, they've never been doing anything. We're all doomed and cursed, kind of thing.
Our prayers don't help us. Prayers don't do a goddamn thing.
And it was like, I like what this is gesturing at, but it felt like so much of this movie was like telling instead of showing. It felt like there was so much dialogue in this movie. It would have been more effective had this movie been this kind of like silent film kind of thing. I wanted more to be left up to the imagination. So what we got a character that you can't really dig your teeth into, a secondary character who's kind of chewing the scenery in a way that feels discontinuous with the tone of the rest of the movie. We've got pacing that continually lets the tension seep out. It's just so flat on every level. There's a lot of pretty shit in this movie. There's this shot that's just this primordial goo, like this purplish reddish swirling of colors Like, this movie knows how to make a pretty image. There are many pretty images in this. This movie, I would argue, maybe some of them are prettier as stills rather than shots that we're staring at for 15 seconds. Something about this movie didn't feel gorgeous if it was trying to be gorgeous, nor did it feel like the style supported the story that was being told. It felt like it was in this weird gap between too good looking and also not good looking enough. I didn't see this on film, so maybe it would have been better with the film grain of a 35mm print or something like that. I saw it on digital, but this movie was so flat and textureless. I was like, I beg you for a little bit of grain. These images feel so digital and so smooth. The thing that made me feel so much about the Longlegs title sequence is that it was grungy. This movie is not grungy. It is so slick. There's so many shots of this movie that take place in this precinct, and it's just the blandest community hall wood paneling you've ever seen. It felt like a lot of the locations in this movie were like, yeah, we got a house. The locations team secured a house. And it was like, okay, what about the house? It felt like a low-budget horror movie that happened to suffer from its lack of interesting and expensive choices. Every ounce of cheapness was laid bare. One of the things everyone was talking about in the lead up to Longlegs is, oh, Nicolas Cage is in this movie. He's in a crazy disguise. And it's like, okay, sweet. I would like to see that. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. And I think that's one of the best things about this movie. Nicolas Cage chewing the scenery in a weird character role. But this motherfucker dies before the end of the movie. He's not even the big bad. What the hell? Happy birthday to you. I will say the scene of him bashing his head in, I liked that. I think that scene was like, thank God we're getting an interesting performance. Like, every time Nicolas Cage was on screen, I was like, I love to see it. I loved how transformed he was. He did not look like himself. He did not sound like himself. The interrogation room scene where he's like hailing Satan or whatever is like, hail Satan. Yeah, that's great. That's the type of movie I want to see. Why is it stuck in this fucking episode of Law and Order? My favorite things about this movie, until they were revealed, were the esoteric and the mysterious. I loved that part of the plot of this movie was there's this weird little haunted sphere that possesses people. I was like, totally, that's really cool. And then the end of the movie, they for some reason felt a need to explain it in detail. This movie would have been so much more effective, in my opinion, if it kept things mysterious and esoteric, but it chose repeatedly to explicitly explain everything.
And from his hiding place within the dolls, the devil did the rest.
I'm just partial to the first half of horror movies because that's the part where you don't know what is happening. And then sometimes at the end, you learn everything that was happening, and then the monster's not as scary. I was, again, talking with my friend Addison about this movie. She was like, oh yeah, Osgood Perkins, his whole thing is just Satan. That's kind of, a lot of his movies come back to using this metaphor of Satan for other societal ills. And I'm like, cool, but also, why is it just Satan? I think Satan is maybe one of the least interesting things something can be at the end of a horror movie. Unless it's like the witch, you know, build and build and build up to this big bad, and then we hear, wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Like, that's good Satan. In this movie, it's just like, ooh, what's it gonna be? This shit is crazy, right? That's right, baby. It's Satan himself. They just worship Satan, and it's Satan. That feels like a cop-out to me. I think it was going for this like eldritch horror of like this great big thing that's under us and we can't control, that pre-exists us. But it's like, then don't give it a name. The minute you attach one of the most common things that people are afraid of to it, you gotta show me why this version of Satan is particularly scary, instead of using Satan to do the heavy lifting of justifying why your thing makes sense or is scary. But here's the other thing. In my Cuckoo video, I talked about how much I loved that Cuckoo didn't explain everything, but audiences had a problem with Cuckoo not explaining everything. So I guess in terms of the landscape of horror and what horror movie fans want, they do kind of want to leave the movie having the horror resolved and wrapped up a bit. They want to know what happened at the end. And I just feel so fundamentally not interested. Also, spoiler, but the mom being the accomplice the entire time was like, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden we have a movie that is commenting on the terror of the familiar, you know, and the fact that the person that she thought she could trust the most was the person that she couldn't. On paper, this works for me. On paper, this makes sense. But in practice, it just kind of felt like a heel turn. The one scene that worked extremely well for me, and has been probably the standout scene for every conversation I've had with anyone, is the scene where the protagonist is alone at home and Longlegs slips into her house and leaves her a note. I was scared for that whole scene. That shit was fucking tense. I did like the doll. I did like the close-up shot of the doll with the eyes veiled behind. Like, that was a cool image. I was saying that this movie explained everything. I love that they never explained why this motherfucker's called Longlegs, except for that one line of dialogue at the beginning.
It seems I wore my long legs today. Well, I got a little baby jewels upon.
The only Osgood Perkins movies that I've seen other than this one is Gretel and Hansel.
I'd hate for you to start something you can't stop.
Which I thought was really pretty, but like there's this cool shot of like this witch pulling hair out of her mouth. And I think that's like a thing that feels like a through line between these two movies, as there are a couple images that are particularly salient that you remember from the movie. But as a whole, they feel like they're kind of gesturing at spooky things more than they are invested in knowing why the things are spooky in the first place. I have this thing, being an editor and having worked in post-production, where sometimes a movie just feels like a source that I'm cutting with and not a film. Sometimes I can't unsee how the sausage was made, and it takes me out of the movie. I feel like both Gretel and Hansel and Longlegs were movies where I felt like I could see how the sausage was being made. They didn't cohere into something greater than we edited this and put sounds to it and color corrected it, you know? I worked on a horror short a couple of years ago that I was so excited about, and then when I edited it, I was like, this is not really good. And I just feel like I have this deep sense of awareness now of what it feels like when something's scary in your head or could be cool on paper, but in execution, it doesn't transcend into that emotional, spiritual thing that we call a movie. This movie, I felt like I was seeing it on the premiere timeline instead of seeing it on the screen. It didn't quite know what it wanted to be. So those are my thoughts on Longlegs. If you liked Longlegs, tell me why in the comments. If I said something that you were like, no, that's not true. If I said something that you disagreed with, I would like to know. If you also agreed with this, I would also like to know, because that would make me feel validated. If you didn't like Longlegs, drop your complaints in the comments. Thank you for watching. like and subscribe. If you want to see more, there's more on Patreon. If you want to help me do this as a job, support myself, continue to make more frequent videos, head on over to my Patreon. I would really appreciate it. You're gonna get updates on my projects as I'm making them, early access to scripts. There's a lot of good shit over there. To accompany every video, I make a bonus video. In the bonus video, I wanna have a little bit of a nuanced conversation about my feelings about the choices made to make Longlegs scary. Sometimes the things that we find funny or scary are that way because they exist outside of the realm of the familiar. And it kind of just reinforces what normalcy is by telling the stories of what we find to be scary. But I feel like so many of the choices that are used to make someone look scary in a horror movie, sometimes they correlate to things that people are and do, not because they're serial killers, but because that's how they are. All right, thanks for watching. Bye, you freaks. I keep filming videos in coats because they look cool, but it is summer and I don't have a fan on. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep filming videos in coats? Ugh. Frick.